Hey guys, welcome to Useless Historian. Tonight I want you to imagine a world with no names, no fire, no footsteps beside your own. Just a single man, not a hero, not a king. Just the first one, the first heartbeat against cold stone, the first breath that didn't echo back. He didn't write anything down, he didn't leave behind tools or temples. But still, the earth remembers him, not in words, not in ruins, but in the quiet, in the shape of the wind, in the way shadows fall when no one is looking. This is what the earth remembered about the first man. A slow story, a still one, the kind meant to be heard with heavy eyes and a quiet heart. If you like these soft, winding stories through time, I'd love if you could subscribe, like and share this with someone else who needs a gentle place to rest tonight. And before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Let me know in the comments. You're part of this too. Now, let's begin. The breath that broke the silence. Before the first word was spoken, before even the idea of sound had meaning, there was a breath. It came slowly, with no urgency. Not a gasp, not a cry, just the soft drawing in of air through lips that didn't yet know how to shape questions. The world didn't respond. There were no echoes yet, no birds to stir, no rustling of leaves made by others. Just the stillness of a world not expecting to be shared. The breath belonged to the first man, not a name, not a story, just a body, lying on its side against the earth, chest rising for the very first time, ribs lifting as if waking from something older than sleep. His skin was warm from the rock beneath him, the last of the day's sun pressed into his back. The light was fading, and he didn't know what that meant. He had never seen night before. When his eyes opened, they blinked not in wonder, but in reaction, to wind, to light, to dust in the air. His limbs moved without understanding what they were, curling toward warmth, stretching into space. His fingers grasped dirt, not because he meant to, but because the ground offered something to hold. The breath broke the silence not with noise, but with presence. The earth felt it, the stillness noticed it. Something had changed, a shift in the rhythm of things. For the first time, a living creature was aware not just of being, but of becoming. He didn't know he was alone, not yet. That realization would come later, when he expected something to answer, and nothing did. But in that first moment, there was no fear, just sensation. The coolness of air entering his lungs, the faint tremble of his own warmth against a colder world. He looked up, and the sky, vast, endless, aching, looked down. And though he couldn't name it, he felt it, that something was watching, not in a way that judged, but in a way that noticed. The sky noticed, the stones noticed. The wind paused for half a second longer than it needed to, and then moved on. He sat up, slowly, muscles unfamiliar with gravity, bones learning their own weight. The breath came again, deeper this time, smoother, as if his body had remembered something before his mind had even begun. That first breath wasn't about survival, it wasn't about speech, it wasn't even about thinking. It was permission, permission to begin, to rise, to reach, to remember, without knowing what memory was. And the earth listened, not with ears, not with thought, but with the slow hum of time stretched over soil and stone. It welcomed him without invitation. It knew what he was, even if he didn't. And though no other breath echoed back, something deep beneath the ground stirred, and said, quietly, yes. Why the first man walked without looking back? He didn't walk because he was searching. He walked because standing still didn't feel like anything yet. There were no footprints behind him to weigh him down, no words tying him to a place, no one to say stay, and nothing to name as home. So he moved forward, not quickly, not with purpose. His legs were unsure, his steps soft, his body still remembering how to be part of the world. He didn't walk like an animal or a spirit. He walked like something brand new, learning balance with every shift of weight. Each footfall pressed into the earth, like a question with no answer. Behind him, the place where he had woken grew smaller, not forgotten, just released. There was no language to describe it, no memory of it forming in his mind, just a sense that he had already taken from it what it had to give. Warmth from stone, the scent of dust, the hush of early light, and now it was time to find what came next. The world wasn't quiet as he walked. It just hadn't yet been taught how to make its sounds feel personal. Wind moved through grass that had never been named. Leaves shifted overhead without knowing what a hand was. Shadows came and went with no awareness they were being noticed. Even the river, wide, slow, deep, rippled past without greeting. He was there, and he wasn't. Present, but not acknowledged. He didn't look back because there was nothing behind him that called his name. Because he didn't have one. No one whispered for him. No fire waited. No tribe wept. There was no past to mourn, no story yet told. Only the steady rhythm of feet moving forward, guided not by destination, but by the shape of curiosity in the bones. The earth beneath his feet wasn't a path. It didn't invite or direct, but it allowed, and he kept going, over rises of rock smoothed by wind, through clearings where sunlight clung like old warmth, across shallow water that touched his legs with chill, and left no mark. Sometimes he stopped, not from exhaustion, but from wonder, at a bird slicing across the sky, at a color he hadn't seen before, red like fruit, not yet touched, at the way the horizon never came closer, no matter how far he moved. He stood still once, when a breeze moved in a circle around him, lifting hair, brushing skin, and then was gone. He turned toward it, thinking, not in words but in instinct, that maybe something had passed close enough to be real, but still, he didn't turn around, because looking back didn't yet exist. Not for him, not in that form. He didn't know what he would find there. He didn't know that what was behind him could even be different than what was ahead, and in that way he was free. Free from regret, from memory, from the weight of moments past. His eyes faced forward because that was where the sun moved, because that was where the warmth drifted, because something deep in his chest, not yet a thought, not yet a fear, whispered that ahead was where life kept happening. And maybe the earth noticed. The way he walked, the absence of backward glances, the untouched clarity of a life not shaped by loss. The earth didn't try to stop him. It didn't rise up to pull him back. It watched, patient still, letting him go, because even the ground knew he would look back someday, but not yet. Not now. Now was for walking, and he walked, not toward anything, but away from nothing. The time before language had a shape. There was no such thing as a word. Not yet. Not in the way we know them now. Not in the way they rise up in the throat and fall neatly into meaning, shaped by breath and habit. Back then, there was only sound, raw, formless, felt more than heard. A grunt, a breath through the teeth, a soft exhale that might have meant pain or fear, or nothing at all. He didn't know what language was. The first man, he didn't know that he could shape a sound and carry it with him like a tool. Didn't know that one day, sounds would carry stories, or names, or the weight of love and loss. But he was beginning to feel the need, not to talk, not yet, but to reach. He had eyes, he could point, he could gesture, but pointing doesn't last. A finger extended toward a thing is useful for a moment, then gone. What he wanted, what he felt, was a different kind of pointing, something that could stay in the air even after the gesture ended. But how do you describe something that doesn't exist yet? That's what it was like. He looked at the river, he knew the river, he could return to it, drink from it, watch the way the light played on its surface, but he couldn't hold it in his mind without seeing it, couldn't tell anyone else where it was, not that there was anyone else yet. Still, the thought was there, blurry around the edges, like smoke curling before it knows what shape to take. The sounds he made weren't chosen, they escaped. A sharp intake of breath when his foot landed in cold water, a quiet groan when hunger gnawed at his belly, a low hum that rose in his chest when the fire crackled nearby. No one taught him these things, they simply arrived, instinct, not invention, but slowly, not in minutes or hours, but across the quiet stretch of days, he began to notice the repetition. That certain feelings made certain sounds, and certain moments called for those sounds again. The ache of missing something, though he had no word for missing, came with a sigh that drew out longer than usual. The relief of warmth brought a quick breath in, almost like laughter, though he'd never heard laughter before. And once, when a shadow crossed his shelter and startled him from sleep, he made a sharp guttural cry that echoed strangely in the cave walls. He paused, listening. The sound felt strange, but powerful. It had shape. He pressed his hand to the wall where the echo had bounced, touched it like it had meaning. He didn't know it yet, but it did, because even without words, the mind wants to remember. And so the early beginnings of language weren't made from syllables or rules. They were made from moments that refused to disappear. He began to murmur when alone, not because he needed to speak, but because it filled the quiet. The rhythm of his own breath gave him comfort. The rise and fall, the faint voice of being alive. Sometimes he would mouth the same sound over and over while stacking stones or scraping bark from a tree, not singing, not talking, just repeating. Repetition was safety, and the world around him started to feel different. The trees still rustled, the birds still scattered. But he began to think, again, not in words but in feeling, that they reacted to his voice. That something in the sound marked him, made him separate from the rest. The world began to divide, not in danger and safety, but in known and not known. And with that division came the need to share, not yet with another person, but even with himself. He began to recognize that sounds could stand for things: the crackle of fire, the hush of the wind before it changed, the bark of an animal, the crunch of a leaf underfoot. These were the first words, not made by mouths, but made by experience. And so he copied them. He tried to mimic the wind in his own breath, tried to make the fire's hiss with his lips, mimicked the bird calls until they sounded almost close, not perfect, not useful, but his own. And in doing so, he began to wrap sound around the world. He was no longer just moving through it. He was beginning to describe it, even if only to himself. One day, he took a burnt stick from the fire and dragged it across the cave wall. A line, then a circle, then a shape he didn't recognize, but that felt like something. It wasn't a picture, it wasn't art, it was a placeholder, for a thought, for a memory, for the feeling of having felt something and not wanting to lose it. He looked at the shape, then made a sound, not a word, but a sound, and in his mind, the two connected. That was the beginning of something. The earliest root, a sound for a shape for a thing for a memory for a feeling, and all of it circling back to one idea, that life was too big to carry in silence. And so he kept walking, and kept making sounds, and every time one of them stayed longer than a breath, he felt like something had been rescued from the dark, not tamed, not named, but remembered. When the sky was a stranger, the first time he really looked at the sky, it didn't comfort him. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't wide or poetic, it was just above him, vast, unreachable, uncertain, a ceiling that never stopped. He didn't know to call it sky, and he didn't yet wonder where it began or ended, but he felt its weight, not heavy, exactly, but present, watching, maybe, or waiting. It changed without asking. One moment it was pale, the next, burning gold, sometimes grey, sometimes thick with cloud, so low it felt like it might press against his hair. At night, it opened up even more, filled with cold pinpricks of light that never moved but never stayed the same, and he didn't know what they were. Not stars, not stories, just distant things, silent things. Sometimes, in those earliest nights, he would lie on his back and stare upward until his breath slowed, but it didn't relax him. It made him feel small in a way that was new, not threatened, not yet, but unsure. The trees he could touch, the river he could cross, fire he could feed, but the sky, he couldn't reach it. He didn't trust what he couldn't touch, and so for a long time he didn't look up unless he had to. The sky didn't offer him food, didn't leave tracks in the dirt, didn't call him the way Earth did. It didn't answer to sound, didn't crackle like fire, or shift like animals. It simply was, and that was stranger than anything. But it wasn't just the vastness that unsettled him. It was the change, because the sky didn't stay still. It faded without warning, bright to dark, warm to cold, calm to storm. Sometimes it wept, sometimes it flashed, sometimes it cracked open and roared, and he had no word for thunder, no understanding of lightning, only the knowledge that light and sound could come from above and vanish just as quickly. He didn't know if the sky meant him harm, but he didn't know if it cared, either, and indifference is its own kind of danger. He watched birds fly across it, and wondered how they touched it without being swallowed. He saw clouds gather and break apart, and wondered if they knew what they were doing. He saw the sun fall behind the trees, and then rise again on the other side, and never understood why. That bothered him, though he had no word for bother. Not knowing, not being able to name or grasp, it gnawed at the edges of his calm, because everything else in his world had rules. Water flowed downward, fire needed fuel, hunger meant motion. But the sky followed something else, And so he began to observe, quietly, cautiously. He started to notice how certain shadows returned at the same time each day, how birds flew in similar directions in the morning, and reversed in the evening, how the light shifted slowly over hours, not randomly, but predictably. And the more he noticed, the more the sky began to seem less like a stranger, not a friend, not yet, but something he could study, something that might speak, not in words but in pattern. He began marking time in his own mind, not in hours or days, but in light and dark, in warm and cold, in loud and still. He stopped seeing the sky as one endless thing, and started seeing its changes as clues. And when rain came, and he was dry because he had seen the clouds gather earlier, he felt something new. He felt powerful. He had understood something, without words, without symbols, without stories. He had read the sky, and in that moment, the sky became less of a stranger, not a god, not yet, but a guide, a rhythm to move with, a silence that could be listened to. And though it would still frighten him, with storms and stars and winds that bent trees, he no longer looked away. He watched, he waited, he listened, because the sky didn't need to come closer, it only needed to be noticed. And in doing that, he took the first steps toward a map that would outlive him, a map written in color, in movement, in shadow, a map only seen by those who knew what the silence was saying. What his hands reached for first before thought, before names, before the sky was anything more than space and stars. There were his hands. They were the first tools, the first questions, the first memory makers. He didn't know them as his own. Not in the way we recognize our limbs now. He didn't look at them and think mine. They were just part of what moved when something needed to be done. But what they reached for, that was important. That was instinct. That was survival, wrapped in curiosity. At first, his hands reached for warmth. Fire, yes, once he found it. But even before that, they reached for the places that held heat longer than the air did. The smooth stone still warm from the afternoon sun. The inside of an animal's hide. The soft beating chest of another body, sleeping nearby. His hands knew where life still lived. And they remembered. They reached for food, of course. Fruit, bark, small creatures, roots. But they also reached to feel, to learn, to test, to hold something, and not just take it but turn it over. His hands were asking, even if his mouth wasn't yet, what is this? What does it do? How does it feel when it breaks, when it bends, when it burns? He never reached the same way twice. Each motion carried more than hunger. It carried memory. The last time his hand closed around a thorn and bled, it remembered, not in language, not in stories, but in the flinch, the pause, before reaching again. That was knowledge taking root without words. He reached for stone, not the sharp ones at first, just the ones that felt right in his palm, the ones that fit, the ones that made a sound when knocked together, a clink that meant something, though he didn't yet know what. Later, those stones would split. Later, they'd become blades. But in the beginning, they were just the first weight his hands chose to carry. He reached for sticks, dry ones, crooked ones, sometimes too brittle to be useful. He broke them, snapped them, scraped them on rock, and when the bark peeled away clean, he held the smooth length like a discovery. Not quite a weapon, not quite a tool, but a beginning. He reached for water, not just to drink, but to see his own reflection, even if he didn't understand it. He reached and watched the ripples distort his shape, saw light bend around his fingers. Something stirred then, the early awareness of self, that what he touched could respond, that the world moved when he moved. And when he reached for ash for the first time, for the cold powder left after fire, he learned what stayed behind, that even after something was gone, part of it remained. His fingers turned grey. He smeared it on stone, not knowing why. Maybe it was a mark, maybe it was a memory. But he reached anyway. Not everything he reached for was useful. Sometimes it was the color of a leaf, the shimmer of a beetle's shell, the soft crunch of old snow. He reached not to take, but to feel. That was a different kind of hunger, one no belly could name. And eventually, he reached for others, the brush of his hand against another's shoulder, the act of pulling someone closer in cold, the quiet offering of something held in his palm, food, fire, warmth, the first signs of what would later be called care. He didn't have a word for sharing, but his hands moved that way, long before his mouth ever did. Hands reached for comfort, for danger, for work, They remembered things the mind had not yet learned to say. They flinched before fear had a name. They steadied when the wind blew hard. They learned texture, temperature, tension. They shaped the world even as they were shaped by it. He never thought, what should I do with my hands? They already knew, even when he didn't understand what he was becoming. His hands did. They reached for life. They reached for understanding. They reached to keep things from being forgotten. And slowly, the world began to answer, one shape at a time, one touch at a time, because the first connection between man and the world wasn't made with words, it was made with reach. The day the wind brought sound. Before voices had shape, before names had meaning, there was the wind. It moved long before anything else did. Through trees that had no names, over stones that hadn't yet been sat on, across plains no feet had walked, the wind was always first. First to arrive, first to leave, and on one particular day, one that no one counted, no one marked, it brought something new. It brought sound, not just rustling or breaking or groaning, though those came too, but sound that meant more. Not quite a word, not quite music, something in between, the kind of sound that made even the birds stop moving for a moment, the kind of sound that made those who heard it pause. That morning, the wind had come earlier than usual. It rolled low through the sleeping grass, and wrapped itself around branches still damp with night. It caught small things, dry leaves, bits of bark, the edge of a broken hide left to dry, and sent them tumbling. But it wasn't just the movement that changed everything, it was the sound it pulled out of those things. A low hum as two limbs rubbed, a rising whistle as the air cut through a hollow reed, a deep thump when a half-buried log was struck just right by a falling stone. None of these were new. Not entirely, but together, strung in the rhythm of a single gust, they became a sequence. They didn't just happen, they unfolded, and someone noticed. One figure, crouched near a bank of cold ash, lifted their head. The sound pulled their gaze upward, not in fear, but in something softer, wonder. Their ears twitched, not at the volume, but at the pattern. Because it wasn't random, it was echo, call, pause. There was a shape to it. They turned their head to follow it, eyes squinting against dust, but their breath held still. Listening had always mattered. For danger, for animals, for the crack of a branch that meant something was nearby. But this was different. This didn't demand running. It asked for stillness, and so they stayed still. Others began to notice too, not all at once, not with excitement, but slowly, carefully, like waking into a new sense. Children who had only heard the wind as noise before now tilted their heads as if something was calling. Elders, those who'd known more winters than names, leaned into the gust like it carried meaning. The sounds moved between them, fluttering like invisible threads. The crack of reeds, the clatter of bark, the sudden silence between gusts, and someone, no one knows who, mimicked it, not perfectly, just a breath, a whistle, a hum, something close, and the others turned to them. A connection was made, a loop was closed, not just hearing, responding. The wind moved on, as it always did. It didn't stay to see what happened, but what it left behind was more than fallen branches and shifting scents. It left the idea that sound could be shaped, that there was something inside the noise that could be listened to, held, repeated. That evening, near the fire, someone tried again. A low whistle, a throat-cleared hum, a hand slapped softly against a log, and someone else answered. The patterns were crude, but they weren't random. They were shaped by memory, by imitation, by curiosity, and for the first time, maybe the very first time, the sounds weren't about survival, they were about expression. The next day, someone strung a hollow reed with fiber. Another found that two stones struck just so made a rhythm. A child, barely able to walk, babbled back at the wind, like it was a friend. And somewhere, quietly, without ceremony, listening became sacred. Not to everything, but to sound that felt like more than accident. They didn't call it music, they didn't call it voice, but they knew it had changed something. Because after that day, the wind wasn't just wind anymore, it was memory, it was call, it was spark. And when the sky went quiet, and the fire burned low, and the trees stopped moving, they remembered that sound, and waited for it to come again. Because now, when the wind came, they listened differently. Why he watched the river without drinking. He was thirsty, that much was clear, though he had no word for it. His lips were cracked, the skin along his cheeks drawn tight with cold and wind. His tongue felt like hide. His body ached not just from hunger, but from the deeper, slower hunger of water withheld. But still, he didn't drink. He sat at the edge of the river, crouched low like the animals he'd seen before, the silent watchers that waited for the surface to still before lowering their heads. But unlike them, he didn't reach forward. Not yet. His eyes were locked on the water, wide and still, like they were waiting to understand something before they acted. The river moved fast that day. Meltwater from higher ground had come roaring down through the gorge, stirring up stone and root and bone along its way. The current didn't speak. It roared. A deep, low, ancient voice without breath, and he watched it not like a hunter watching prey, but like a child watching fire for the first time. He wasn't afraid, not in the sharp way one feels when eyes meet a predator. This was different. It was slower, it was heavier, the river meant something. That's what he felt, even if he couldn't say it. And so he didn't drink. Not right away. He waited. Others had already dipped their hands in. A few had even crouched close and scooped the icy water up to their faces. But he had seen what came after. The shivering, the sharp, wet coughs, the eyes that looked back confused, unsure if the gift had healed or harmed. He had seen one too many drinks taken with hands that trembled, followed by nights of silence, of fever, of watching someone slip away. So he watched what floated. He watched what sank. He watched the way a single leaf spun on the edge of the current, never crossing, never returning. He watched a broken twig travel the length of the bend and disappear like a thought forgotten. He watched fish beneath the surface dart and vanish, bright flashes of silver that reminded him of lightning, quick, beautiful, untouchable. And then he watched his reflection. That may have been the reason he waited. There, just below the surface, was a face he half recognized, not because he knew himself, but because the water had memory. He had seen faces like his in the river before, older, younger, distorted by time and ripples. He had watched an elder once, reaching for water only to freeze, staring at his own reflection like he'd seen a ghost. That elder had not lived many more moons after that, and though no one said it aloud, the river had taken something from him, or shown him something, or both. So now he waited. He watched not just for danger but for meaning, because something in him had changed. This wasn't the first river he'd seen, but it was the first time he felt that he was being seen by the river. He noticed how the surface responded to breath, how the steam that left his mouth blurred the image of the world reflected back. He noticed how birds never landed near the center, how the coldest winds always came after the loudest water. He noticed how certain parts of the river were louder, darker, deeper, and others whispered, and in that whispering, he heard memory, not his own, but the earth's. This river had run longer than fire had burned. It had carved the land before the tribe knew to follow the seasons. It had held the bones of beasts they'd only seen in dreams, their tusks still hidden beneath silt and time. And he was a part of that now, not above it, not even beside it, within it. When he finally knelt forward, he didn't drink immediately. He placed his hands at the edge of the bank, palms flat. He pressed his fingers into the wet mud. He let the cold climb up his arms. He listened to the hum inside the motion, the churn, the song of what had come before. And then he leaned forward, not to consume, to greet. His lips touched the surface softly, not like a gulp, but like a question. And the water answered. It tasted of stone, of time, of blood and memory. It burned at first, the kind of burn only the cold can give. But then it faded, and with it something inside him opened. He didn't drink more than a mouthful. It was enough, because this wasn't about quenching thirst. It was about recognition, that the river gave life, but also watched, that it could take, but also remember, that it held more than water, it held story. And so when he stood, he did so quietly, carefully, like the land itself had heard him. He left no mark, no trail, only silence, and the sound of water still moving, always moving. The first shelter that wasn't built. They didn't plan it. That's what makes it important. Because this shelter wasn't made of intention or shaped by hands that set out to build. It wasn't stacked with stone or stitched from hide. No bones were lashed into beams. No fire was kindled in its center. There were no tools nearby. No footprints circling the space. And yet, they stayed, and it held them. It was the first shelter that wasn't built, and it mattered more than most of the ones that came after. It began with a shadow. That's how they found it. Not looking for safety, but walking away from something else. The sun was low that day, caught in that soft moment before setting, where light isn't just light, it's memory, gold, stretched and heavy. That's when they saw the curve in the hillside, a dip, shallow and overgrown, but strangely inviting. Not dramatic, not a cave, just less wind, less light, less sound. The oldest one in the group paused first, not because they were afraid, but because their legs ached in a way that meant a storm was coming. That kind of ache didn't lie, and without a word, they sat. The others followed, more from instinct than decision. No one asked if this was where they'd stay. No one assigned roles, no one gathered wood. The younger ones dropped their bundles with a soft sigh, like the ground itself had asked to carry the weight for a while. They didn't dig. They didn't clear brush. They simply folded into the land. Above them, branches leaned just so. The hill curled like a body, like an old animal that remembered warmth and wanted to share it again. Moss grew thick, where the wind couldn't reach. The earth beneath was soft but not damp, the kind of ground that knew how to hold without taking. And something about that spot felt, watched, not by eyes, but by time. So they stayed. That first night, they didn't light a fire, not out of fear, but because they didn't need one. The wind passed over them without touching. The sky opened above them without spilling. Even the animals in the nearby brush made no protest, as if this space was already claimed, not by people, but by purpose. A place meant for rest, long before anyone ever knew to call it shelter. They slept close, closer than usual, not out of cold, but out of knowing, somehow, that this place had seen others before. That somewhere beneath the roots and leaves were the bones of old stories, and they didn't want to disturb them. In the morning, no one spoke of leaving. They didn't say it, but each person moved a little slower, gathering water, checking the horizon, returning again to the hollow. There was no wall, no roof, and yet it held their backs like a home. Birds landed nearby, bugs avoided them, and for the first time in many moons, no one dreamed of fire, because they felt covered. And the elders, the ones who remembered too much, watched the young lie down in the crook of the hill, and understood. This was what came before building, before shaping, before changing the land. It was listening to the land, letting it offer what it already held. It wasn't the strongest shelter, a proper storm would have found its way in. A predator could still sniff its edges, but that didn't matter. What mattered was what it wasn't. It wasn't forced. It wasn't stolen. It wasn't made by taking from anything else. It was a gift. That's what the old woman said before sleep, her hand pressed into the soil, like she was touching someone's shoulder. This place was waiting, she whispered. It just didn't know for who, and so they didn't build. Not that day, they let the earth hold them. And in the days after, when they finally moved on, pulled by hunger, or season, or whatever wind called next, they didn't take anything from that place. No stone, no stick, not even a memory carved into bark. They just walked. But every person, when passing that place again, even years later, even after children had grown and fire had become common, they'd pause, even for a moment. Even if they didn't know why, because they remembered the shelter that wasn't built, and how it had held them anyway. When hunger meant more than food, they used the word the same way we do now, or rather, they felt it, a tightening beneath the ribs. A dull weight in the belly that refused to let you forget it was there. But for them, hunger wasn't just about the body. Not really. It was something bigger, something older, something that reached beyond the mouth, beyond the stomach, beyond the days when food was simply a matter of survival. Because hunger, true hunger, meant longing. It meant absence, and absence had many names. There were times when the belly was full, but the soul remained aching, when meat sizzled on stone and hands were wrapped around warm bone, but no one laughed, no one shared stories. That was a different kind of hunger, one that came when someone was missing, when the circle around the fire was incomplete, a hollow in the air, where a voice should have been. Hunger for a presence, hunger for safety, hunger for the rhythm of life before the silence set in. Children learned early to recognize both kinds. They could go days without a proper meal, and they often did, but it was the hollow tone in a mother's voice that told them what kind of hunger was worse. It wasn't just the empty stomach, it was the nights without fire, the days without a single bird call, the sound of breathing around them, held just a little too long. That was when they knew food wouldn't be enough. The elders spoke about a time before meat, before cooking, before even fire, a time when hunger was constant, and not just for flesh, for shelter, for warmth, for touch, for understanding. The kind of hunger that made the eyes search the horizon for shapes that didn't come. The kind of hunger that made people start walking, even if they didn't know where they were going. And when they told these stories, they didn't talk about hunting techniques or how to strip fat from bone. They spoke of songs, yes, songs, because hunger needed to be named. Even the invisible kind. The kind that pulled at your spirit in the middle of the night, long after your stomach had been fed. They had songs for loneliness, for longing, for the ache of remembering something you couldn't hold anymore. They sang those songs not to find food, but to fill the other emptiness. There was a word in their tongue, or what passed for one, that meant both to hunger and to search. It wasn't a mistake. To feel the absence of something was to begin the act of reaching for it. Whether that meant walking miles for fruit, or simply sitting closer to someone when the cold came early. Hunger wasn't weakness. It was direction. It was how they knew they still wanted to live. Sometimes on days when the land gave nothing, no tracks, no roots, no luck, they'd gather anyway, not to eat, but to speak, to share the ache, to let the feeling exist in the air between them instead of hiding it in their own bones. They knew that if hunger stayed unspoken long enough, it turned into something else, something harder, sharper, something that cut instead of connected, and they couldn't afford that. Not when everything they had depended on the space between them. So they sat, they sang, they told stories with dry throats and empty hands, and strangely, it helped. Because being hungry together was different from being hungry alone. One could be endured, the other could not. Later, when fire came, and meat grew more common, the hunger changed again. It became quieter, slower, but it was still there, still hiding behind every moment of silence between words. Still coiled inside the glances people gave each other when one took more than they should. Still in the way someone watched another chew, not out of jealousy, but memory. They remembered what it meant to go without, and they remembered that sometimes the worst hunger had nothing to do with food. Why the earth moved under his feet. He didn't know the word for it. He didn't need one. What mattered was how it felt. How the ground, usually still, usually steady, shifted just enough to remind him it was alive. It wasn't an earthquake, not in the way we'd name it now. Nothing cracked, nothing fell, but the earth moved. He felt it with his heels, a low hum, a stretch beneath the skin of the world, and it changed him. The day had started like most did, light filtering in through the canopy, the wind carrying the scent of damp wood, the ground soft with old leaves. He was young enough to still feel new to walking, but old enough to know he was walking alone for the first time. His steps were cautious, not because of fear, but because he knew each step meant something. Each footprint left a mark, and even if the rain would take it later, the act of pressing his foot into the world meant he belonged to it now. But then the ground shifted, just enough to stop him mid-step. Not enough to stumble, not enough to panic, just enough. At first he thought it was his imagination. A bird overhead, a wind trick, but then it happened again. A subtle push, a slow slide beneath the surface, like the bones of the world adjusting. And suddenly, his feet didn't feel like they were standing on something separate. They felt like they were standing on someone. It changed the way he looked at everything. Before that moment, the earth had been a thing to walk on, a thing that held his weight, gave him berries, let him lie down when he was tired. But now it felt awake, not watching, exactly, but aware. He crouched, pressing his palm into the dirt. The tremble was gone, but the memory of it lingered. The earth was warm that day, not with heat, but with history. He felt it under his fingers, as if the moment he touched it, he wasn't just feeling soil, he was feeling the weight of every step that had come before. He didn't move for a long time, and when he did, it wasn't with the lightness he had started with. He walked as though the land beneath him could hear, as though every shift of his heel, every toe pressed into dust, meant something more than movement. Later that night, he didn't tell anyone, not because he was afraid they wouldn't believe him, but because he didn't know how to explain it. He tried to start the words a few times, mimicking the motion with his hand, tapping the ground near the fire, but it didn't feel right. It felt like trying to explain a dream that wasn't a dream, like trying to describe the feeling of remembering something you'd never been told. So he held it, but it changed him. From then on, he noticed things others didn't. The way the moss grew in slow spirals around certain rocks, the way branches leaned toward dry gullies long before the rains came. He noticed when the birds went silent, not just that they did, But why? He noticed how the roots below a tree told you more than the fruit above it, because he'd felt it, that shift, that reminder that the earth wasn't just there to support him, it was living its own story. He began to walk differently, to pause more often, not out of hesitation, but reverence. Every place he stood became a kind of conversation, every campfire, a listening post, and others began to notice, not the moment itself, but what he had become because of it. Some started asking him where to camp, others watched where he stepped, mimicking the way he read the ground, and though he never claimed to know more than them, they began to call him the one who heard the earth first. Years later, when they told stories to children too small to remember his name, they spoke of a boy who felt the land breathe once, and how from that moment on, he never walked the same again. They didn't say it moved under him anymore, they said it moved with him, and somewhere in the spaces between each footstep, he could still feel it, a pulse, a promise, a rhythm older than any word. The earth never stopped moving, he had simply learned how to feel it. The first shadow that followed him. He didn't notice it at first. Shadows were everywhere in his world, soft-edged beneath branches, scattered between trees, dancing along cave walls, but this one was different. This one stayed with him. It began on a morning when the sky felt newer than usual, washed clean by a long night of cold wind and distant howling. The sun rose slow, gold and cautious, stretching across the leaves like it was still unsure if the day should begin. He had wandered away from the shelter early, chasing the warmth like an instinct. Barefoot on packed earth, arms folded against the last chill, he walked with the quiet curiosity that only comes to those who don't know yet what not to disturb. And then it happened. The light crested a rock and spilled over him, and something moved where nothing had been. At first he thought it was another presence, someone behind him, maybe a silent animal or another child. But when he turned, there was no one, just him, and that strange dark shape, echoing his own body, stretching long behind him on the stone. He stepped sideways, so did it. He crouched. It followed. He reached out. So did the shadow, arm thin and perfect, in its echo. He stared at it for a long time, unsure. It didn't speak. It didn't make sound. But it moved when he did, as if bound to him by an invisible string, as if it had always been there, waiting for him to notice. In his world everything had meaning, or the potential for it. Shapes in clouds, circles in fire, ash, the way wind curved around a shelter. This too must have meaning. Something that moved only when he moved. Something that mirrored his form but not his weight. Something that disappeared when he stepped into shadow, but reappeared the moment he returned to light. He called it nothing, because he had no word. But still he watched it. The first day it followed from morning until the clouds thickened by dusk. It climbed over roots when he did. It stretched long when he ran, compressed tight when he sat. He showed it to no one, not because it was a secret, but because it felt like something that belonged only to him, or perhaps something that had claimed him in return. The second day, it came again. So he began to test it. He waved his arms. The shadow obeyed. He stood still for so long his legs ached, just to see if it would lose interest. It didn't. It stood with him in silence, patient and unblinking. By the third day he had accepted it, not as a trick of the sun, not as something to explain, but as a companion. It didn't judge, didn't question, didn't interrupt his wandering thoughts. It simply was, always there when the light allowed it, always gone when the fire dimmed or the sky closed in with rain. It became something like breath, present, unnoticed, until it wasn't. Sometimes he wondered, was it a part of him, or something that chose him? One night, huddled beside the fire, he turned his head and saw it flickering behind him, distorted by the flame. It danced like it was alive. He blinked slowly, and in that moment of tired dreaming, it looked almost human, almost separate. He whispered to it then, just once, "I see you," not out of fear, not even out of wonder, just recognition. After that, things changed, not in any way he could describe, but in quiet ways that lived in his chest and fingertips. He became more aware of the light, of where it fell, of how it curved. He moved through the world like someone who knew he was not truly alone. Even when no others were near, others noticed. They began to say he walked as if someone trailed him, as if he was waiting for a second set of footsteps to join his own, as if he saw things no one else did. He never explained. He didn't know how. Over time he watched his shadow grow shorter when the sun stood high. He watched it stretch ahead of him at dusk. He watched it vanish under clouds, and waited for it to return when the sky cleared. He came to believe it had moods, that it liked sometimes more than others, that it disappeared not because of absence, but because it was giving him space. And in his quiet moments, long after others had fallen asleep, he'd sit near the edge of the firelight and trace its memory on the ground with his finger. This shape that wasn't him, but was always with him. Years later, when he had children of his own, they asked what the dark shape was that walked beside them. He told them gently, with a smile not everyone understood. It's you, but quieter. It's the part of you the light remembers. And when they asked if it ever went away, he shook his head. No, only hides, only waits. Because that was the truth. The first shadow that followed him never truly left, and from that day on, he was never completely alone again. When he didn't know the sun would return, the nights had always been long, but this one felt endless. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest, wrapped in a hide that still held the scent of smoke and old fur. The fire in front of him had grown tired, more red than orange now, more whisper than roar. The others slept in a ring, their breaths quiet, slow, rising like steam into the open dark. Above him, the sky had turned to ink, and the stars were scattered like forgotten seeds. But the sun was gone, not hidden, gone. He didn't know it yet, but this was the first time he had truly feared the sky. As a child, he'd watched the sun rise every day, with the casual acceptance of someone who believed in patterns. It rose, it warmed, it faded, it slept, but it always came back. Always, until now. This night, the horizon stayed black, the cold came earlier, the stars seemed sharper, angrier, and the fire wasn't enough. He had no words for doubt, but he felt it in his chest. Something pressing, something hollow. He remembered how the light used to touch the tops of the trees first, slow and golden, like it was waking everything gently. But now the trees were just outlines, motionless. He stared until his eyes hurt, waiting for the color to come back, but it didn't. Not yet. He kept looking east, even as the fire called him to tend it, even as his hands began to ache with cold. His thoughts circled the same quiet truth. What if it doesn't rise this time? What if the sky has forgotten us? What if the warmth has moved on to somewhere better? The fear wasn't loud, it was slow, a creeping thing. It sat beside him, invisible but real, like the shadow of something you don't want to name. No one had ever explained the sun to him, not in words, not in stories, it just was. But now, in the hush of a sky that gave no promise, he realized he didn't know it would return, and that unknowing changed him. He began to imagine a world without light. What would happen to the trees, the rivers, the bones of animals left on the grass? Would the fire still burn if the sky never lit up again? Would his people still laugh, still speak, still remember, or would everything fall asleep forever? He pressed his hand to the ground. It was cold, not cruel, just empty. The kind of cold that felt like an absence, not a punishment. For the first time, he wondered if they'd done something wrong. Maybe they had spoken too loud by the river. Maybe someone had taken a piece of light they weren't meant to keep. Maybe the sun was waiting for them to notice something, to understand a lesson buried beneath the frost and ash. And as he sat there, alone in his doubt, he realized something else. The sun's return had always been a gift, not a guarantee. He didn't sleep that night. He stayed with the fire, feeding it with twigs and bits of bark, hoping it would act as a signal, a message. We are still here. We remember you. When the horizon finally softened, just a little, just enough to suggest light might return, he didn't cheer. He didn't speak. He only stared, wide-eyed and wordless, as the first grey hint of morning stretched across the ground like a whisper of forgiveness. It wasn't gold yet, it wasn't bright, but it was coming, and that was enough. He sat there until the first true ray broke over the hills and touched his feet, and in that exact moment, he breathed out for the first time in hours. That was the day he learned something no one had taught him. The sun doesn't owe us its return. We wait, we hope, and when it does come back, we begin again. Why he listened to trees that didn't speak. He didn't know what language was yet. Not truly, but he knew silence. And more than that, he knew the difference between the kind of silence that waited for a voice and the kind that didn't need one at all. That's what the trees gave him. It started when he wandered too far one morning, further than the others would have allowed if they'd been watching. The cold dew still clung to the grass, and the sky hadn't fully decided whether to brighten. He followed a squirrel without thinking, curious about the way its tail bobbed, about how it vanished and reappeared between trunks like it knew something he didn't. By the time he stopped walking, the camp was long behind him, and he stood at the edge of the denser forest, a place where even the birds hesitated to sing. He didn't feel afraid. The forest didn't shout, didn't rush him, didn't ask questions. It just stood there, older than fire, older than words. He stepped into it like stepping into a breath held by the earth itself. The canopy above dimmed the light, softening it into a deep green hush. The air felt cooler, but not cold, heavy, but not unwelcome. It carried the smell of moss and bark, and something else, something almost like memory. He sat near the base of a thick tree, one whose roots twisted above the ground like fingers trying to remember a shape. He didn't touch it, not at first. He just sat, still, listening. The trees didn't speak, not in ways anyone could name, but they also didn't ignore him. He could feel that much. The way the leaves shifted above, as if reacting to more than just wind. The way the bark flaked just slightly, as if breathing. The way the forest accepted his presence, without asking anything in return. He wasn't used to that. People asked. People moved. People made sounds and rules and patterns. But the trees simply were. He stayed for hours that first time, watching the light slant across bark, listening to the tiny creaks and groans deep in trunks. He began to notice things. The difference in sound between leaves touched by breeze and those brushed by a bird's wing. The rhythm of a distant branch swaying. The small, almost invisible fall of old needles from above, landing like feathers. He didn't understand what he was hearing, but he felt it. It wasn't silence. It was something older, something slower. A conversation that didn't care if he answered. A story that didn't pause for his understanding. That was why he returned, again and again, not to ask questions, but to remember how to listen without expecting words. Sometimes he brought others. Sometimes they grew bored, wandered off. He never explained why he stayed behind. What could he say? That the trees knew things, that their stillness held more truth than fire, that the oldest ones had scars that looked like maps, and if you stared long enough, you could almost read where they had been. No one would believe him. That was fine. He didn't need belief. He just needed the quiet. There was one tree, deep in the forest, that became his, not because he chose it, but because it never moved when he came near. Others creaked or bent, or sighed with the wind. This one remained steady, solid, as if waiting for him alone. He began to sit with his back against it, palms pressed flat to the roots, not asking, not praying, just listening. And sometimes in the stillest moments, when even the insects hushed, he felt something deep in his chest echo back, a thud, a weight, a recognition. It wasn't language. It didn't need to be. Years later, when someone asked him how he learned to watch weather, how he knew when the air would turn bitter, or the sky would break open with snow, he only smiled. He pointed to the trees. They tell you, he said softly, if you listen long enough. Because in a world without books, without clocks, without maps, the trees were all of it. Memory, rhythm, story, warning. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They had already said everything. You just had to be quiet enough, long enough, to hear it. The night he thought he was the only thing alive. The night had never felt so deep. Not cold, though the air had bite. Not dark, though the stars had all been swallowed by cloud. It was something else. Something quieter, wider, as though the world had taken a breath in and forgotten to let it out. He'd wandered off at dusk, chasing a sound he couldn't place. Maybe an animal, maybe just wind against stone. But whatever it was, it pulled him farther than he meant to go. And by the time he realized how far he'd come, the horizon had already dimmed. The light had drained from the sky, the way water leaves cracked earth. Slowly, then all at once. He wasn't scared at first. He had been alone before, but this was different. He sat on a patch of dry earth between two crooked boulders, his knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped around himself. The world around him had gone still. Not just quiet, still, no owls, no insects, not even the trees moved. It was as if everything had paused, as if the whole earth had turned its attention elsewhere. He rubbed his arms, not for warmth, but to remind himself he was there, real, breathing. The ground beneath him was solid, but it felt distant, like he was floating just above it, like he could fall through it if he stopped holding tight. His breath was the only sound. Heel, out, heel, out. Suddenly, he tried to make it quieter, smaller. Maybe if he made himself small enough, the night wouldn't notice him. Maybe if he slowed down, he could disappear into the stillness, instead of being the only thing left inside it. The stars didn't come out. That unnerved him most of all. He looked up, and saw nothing. just a dark ceiling with no cracks of light, no familiar shapes to count, to guide him, to name. It was like the sky had turned its back, and for a moment, a long moment, he believed he might be the last thing left awake in the world, the only thing that hadn't stopped. He imagined the others, back at the fire, curled beneath hides, sleeping with hands tucked near the coals. He imagined animals tucked in burrows, birds with heads under wings, trees dreaming slowly. Everything was resting, except him. He was awake, and suddenly, awake meant alone, truly alone. He whispered something, just a sound, just to hear it break the silence. It startled him. It felt wrong, like shouting in a temple, like cracking something ancient. He didn't speak again. Instead, he began to listen for signs. A rustle, a footstep, a breath of wind. Nothing came. The night did not answer, and so he curled tighter. He thought of strange things, what it might feel like to be the last person who remembered fire. What would happen if the sun didn't return? What if the silence never ended? What if this was the end? He began to weep, softly, without reason, not loud, not panicked. Just the slow leaking kind of sadness that comes when your heart feels too far from everything it loves. Tears fell, unnoticed, into the dust, and still, nothing moved. Then, at last, a sound. Faint, soft, the faintest creak of a branch above, not wind, not weight, just life. Just proof that something else still breathed, still shifted, still endured. He held onto that sound like it was fire itself. More followed, a whisper of leaves, a sigh from the grass, the slow groan of the earth stretching beneath him. The night had not ended, but it had returned, and with it came the deep comfort of not being alone. He lay down on his side, cheek against the cool ground. He didn't try to sleep, he didn't need to, he just stayed there, breathing with the world. Not the only thing alive, just one part of it, at peace again. What he saw in his first reflection. He didn't know the word for it, not yet, but the moment stopped him. It had rained the day before. Not much, just enough to make the ground soft and leave a few shallow puddles behind. He was following a deer trail near the edge of a clearing, barefoot, stepping quietly over wet roots and stones, when something glinted at the edge of his vision. At first he thought it was a piece of sky caught in a crack in the ground, a drop of cloud trapped in the mud. But when he leaned closer, crouched low to the earth, he saw eyes, his own, not in another face, not carved in bark or painted on a wall. They looked back at him from still water, no wider than his hand. The surface wavered slightly with the breeze, but the shape was there, the dark of his pupils, the ridge of his nose, the line of his jaw. He blinked, and the figure in the water blinked back. He fell backward onto his hands, startled. The water rippled with the motion. The face broke apart, and in that instant, he wasn't sure it had been real. He waited. When the puddle stilled again, the face returned. This time, he didn't flinch. He stared. For a long time, longer than he'd ever looked at anything that wasn't fire or danger. He tilted his head. The reflection did the same. He reached out. The reflection followed. He opened his mouth, and watched a mouth open back. It wasn't magic. Not exactly, but it felt like the world had peeled open a secret, just for him. There was something unsettling about it too, seeing himself from the outside. He'd felt his body all his life, in movement, in cold, in ache, but he'd never seen it like this. The slope of his forehead, the mess of his hair, the way one of his ears tilted farther back than the other. He looked older than he expected, not in years, but in weight, in wares, in something behind the eyes that didn't have a name yet. He wondered if this was what others saw when they looked at him, if the people who sat near the fire, or shared food with him, or watched him from the other side of the shelter, if this is what they carried of him in their minds. It was strange, knowing his face was something that could be known. He dipped a finger into the water. The face vanished again, just circles now, breaking outwards. He waited until they stilled, then leaned in again. There he was. The wind shifted. He saw the reflection of clouds passing behind his face. He turned around to check. They were really there. The sky mirrored in the water, the trees, his own face at the center of it. He wasn't just looking at himself. He was looking at his place in the world, surrounded, held, reflected. And then he noticed something else, the shadow of something moving behind him, tall and slow. A tree, a bird, no, just a shift of light. But for a breath he thought he wasn't alone, that maybe the reflection wasn't just showing what he was, But who had been watching all along? The puddle shrank as the day warmed. Sunlight drank it slowly, until only damp earth remained. The face disappeared with it, but the memory stayed. He would go back to that spot again, days later, hoping the water had returned. Sometimes it had, sometimes it hadn't. But each time he saw his reflection again, he saw something slightly different, not because the water changed, but because he had. He started to wonder what animals saw when they looked into water, if they recognized themselves, or just saw a moving shape. He thought of his ancestors, those who had walked before, and wondered if they'd ever seen their own faces, or if he was the first to look into water and feel that strange tight stillness in his chest, the feeling of being seen, even by yourself, even in silence. And from then on, whenever he passed still water, he looked down, not to check, not for vanity, but for reminder that he was real, that he had shape, that he belonged in the world he walked through, because now he carried a face with him, not just inside his head, but in the world, and somehow, that changed everything. Why the cold felt like a question. It didn't always hurt at first. That was the trick of it. When the cold arrived, not the breeze that rustled trees or the chill of early dusk, but the real cold, the kind that changed how the world moved. It came quietly, gently, almost. It slipped into the bones like a thought, like a doubt, and that's why it felt like a question. Long before the frost glazed the edges of leaves, before the fire began to shrink into itself, before the sky lost its color and turned pale, like something afraid to speak, the cold would ask. Not out loud, it didn't have a voice, but the body heard it anyway. Will you last this night? That was always the first one, never shouted, just breathed, soft into the back of the neck. The kind of question you didn't want to answer, but had to, with your heartbeat, with your breath, with your stillness, or your movement. Because in the ancient world cold didn't kill quickly, it waited. You'd wake in the dark hours, the ones that stretched forever before the sun returned, and you'd feel it, not on the skin first, deeper, a stiffness in the knees, an ache behind the ribs, a strange stillness in the fingers, as if they were thinking of not waking up, and the cold would ask again, what will you give to make it to morning? The fire, if it hadn't been fed in time, was already fading. Maybe just a few coals, maybe less. You could feel every inch of space between you and the heat. You knew how far you were from survival, by the distance between your body and the last glow of ember. Sometimes, you'd move closer. Sometimes, you'd stay still, and hope someone else would. And the cold would wait, not with anger, not with urgency, with patience, like it knew. It would slip into the shelter, through cracks in the hide, through seams in the walls, under the layers of skin and fur. It would press its hand against the curve of your spine, and whisper again, is this where you end? It didn't ask to scare you. That wasn't its way. The cold wasn't cruel, it simply was. A fact of the world, like hunger, or fire, or night. But it didn't let you forget. That was the cold's role, to remind, to measure. The strongest among them would rise before the others, stir the ashes, feed the flame. But even they would sometimes pause, stare into the dark, and feel it. That quiet question curling around their lungs. Is it still worth waking up? Some didn't. Some let the numbness become silence. They sank into stillness so slowly that no one noticed at first. And when they were found, their faces were soft, not afraid, just gone. The cold didn't celebrate. It didn't mourn. It simply moved on. But those who woke, those who stirred and stretched their aching limbs, and shook the frost from their lashes, they'd carry the question with them all day, into the hunt, into the work, into the way they looked at the fire, come evening. Because once you heard the cold ask if you would last, you never quite forgot the sound, not in words, in weight, in breath, in the silence between heartbeats. Even now, long after shelters became homes and fires came with switches and blankets piled high on soft beds, some nights still carried the same question. When the wind howled against windows and the sky turned the color of bone, when you woke without reason in the middle of the night and pulled the covers tighter, some part of you still remembered the question the cold once asked, and you answered it by staying alive. When his fingers drew shapes in the dirt, he hadn't meant to make anything at all. It started, as many things did, with waiting. The sun was high and heavy, and the deer trail he had followed all morning had disappeared into thorns. He sat down in the shade of a sloping rock, pulled his knees up to his chest, and rested his chin on them. The earth beneath him was warm, soft in places, dry in others. Not grass, not mud, Just dirt, dust and grain and small pebbles, crushed by the weight of time. His hand moved without thinking, first just to shift a stone, then a finger pressed into the soil, a line, a shallow trench, then another, crossing it. The motion felt good. The dirt gave way easily. He moved slower, then faster. Circles, angles, curves. He wasn't copying anything he'd seen before. Not a track, not a pattern from a tree or an animal's path. This was something else. This was his. At first he didn't know why it mattered, but as the shapes took form, one after another, an odd stillness settled into his chest, a quiet, a hum, like the dirt had been waiting for this, like it already knew what he was going to draw. He paused, looked at the marks. They weren't useful, they didn't trap or feed or warn, but they felt true, like they meant something, even if the meaning hadn't arrived yet. He touched one of the curved shapes with his thumb, then pressed another line beside it, a twin. His breath slowed. The breeze moved softly behind him, rustling a few dry leaves, but he didn't look up. He was inside something now. Not the shelter, not a cave, but a moment, a kind of awareness he hadn't touched before. He tried to repeat one of the shapes again, a spiral this time, but it came out differently, still familiar, but not the same. His fingers hovered above the dirt, uncertain. Then he smiled, just slightly, and kept going. It wasn't about perfection. There was no wrong here, just trying, just exploring. When he glanced back, he saw a whole section of ground covered in trails, lines and loops, and not quite symbols, scattered, like a forgotten language. And maybe it was the beginning of a language, not made of voice or sound, but of touch, of memory pressed into the earth. A way to leave thought behind, not in the air where it vanished, but in the ground, where it stayed. He realized then that the shapes weren't just his, they were his story, his day, his feeling. A reflection not in water, but in the soil beneath him. Something from inside, made visible. The dirt welcomed it, accepted it, let itself be marked without resistance, and in that he felt something like partnership. The earth had always carried him, fed him, but now, it was listening. He drew slower after that, not because he was tired, but because it felt like he was speaking. And when you speak to something for the first time, you go gently. He drew the curve of a river, remembered from 2 seasons ago, the arch of an animal's rib, a circle that looked like a sun. Then beside it, a smaller one, maybe a moon, or maybe just a thought that felt round. Eventually the shadows stretched, the light changed. He knew he should move, go back, hunt, rejoin the others. But he didn't erase the marks, he left them there, open, waiting, and he knew someone else would find them. Maybe not today, maybe not for many moons, but when they did, they would kneel like he did. They would touch the lines, and maybe, just maybe, they would feel what he had felt. A whisper in the dirt, a shape that meant something more, not just what he saw, but who he was. The first time he returned to the same place, it wasn't something people did then, not often, not on purpose. The world was too wide, too wild. Life pushed forward like a river that didn't look back. There were always new paths, new valleys, new fears to chase or flee from. To return somewhere was to challenge the rhythm of survival. But still, he came back, not because he had to, but because something inside him whispered that he should. The land didn't look the same at first. The trees had grown in strange ways. The shape of the sky through their branches felt slightly wrong, as if it had tilted while he was away. The stone he'd once leaned against was cracked now, its edge softened by rain. The trail he had followed months ago was covered in fallen leaves and old silence. But his feet remembered it, not with certainty, not like a map, but like muscle memory, a pull in the legs, a twinge in the chest. The body knew more than he realized. He didn't expect the marks to still be there. Yet when he stepped into the clearing, the small patch of earth where he had once drawn with his fingers, where he had first tried to speak to the ground without words, his breath caught. The dirt had shifted, but the shapes were still visible, faint but faithful. Time had softened the edges. A few were blurred, but others remained untouched, like the wind had decided to spare them, or like the earth itself had chosen to keep them. He knelt down slowly, not to draw this time, just to see, to feel. There was something sacred about it now, not in the way the elders spoke of spirits or omens, but in the quiet, in the way the air stilled around him. He ran his hand across one of the curves, and for a moment it was like touching a younger version of himself, one who hadn't known yet that thoughts could survive outside the body, one who hadn't believed anything he made could last. He sat for a long time, tracing the shapes in silence. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The place spoke for him. It carried the memory not just of what he had made, but of who he had been. Tired, curious, afraid, hopeful. All of it was still here, woven into the lines, resting in the dust. The idea that something could be revisited, that the past didn't vanish completely, was strange, powerful. It meant the world wasn't just motion and escape. It meant it could hold something, remember something. It meant he could be remembered. He looked around and realized that everything was watching. The trees, the birds, the wind, not like people did, with eyes and thoughts, but with presence, with awareness. Like the land itself understood that he had come back. Maybe that was what mattered. Not that the marks had survived, but that he had changed enough to return to them. He pressed his palm into the earth beside the old shapes, not to add anything, not to start over, just to say, I was here again. To leave a moment behind, to give the place something new. Then he stood, not quickly, not slowly, just with care. And as he walked away, he didn't feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was carrying it forward, because now he knew the world could be returned to. And when he came back next time, he wouldn't be looking for what he had left. He'd be looking for what had waited for him. Why the rain wasn't just water. At first it was only a sound, a soft tapping on the leaves. Far away, almost too distant to name. Then the smell followed, the strange, sweet scent of dry earth waking up. They didn't know what caused it then, not in words, but they recognized it instantly. That quiet promise in the air, that pause between breaths. It meant rain was coming, and rain was never just rain. He stood at the edge of the trees, watching the sky fold into itself. The clouds had moved in silently, but now they pressed lower, heavier, like they were remembering something sad. The others had already gone to prepare the hides, to tuck the fire deeper into the rock shelter, to cover what they could. But he lingered, because he remembered the last time it rained, the one before that, and the one before that. Each storm had taken something. Sometimes it was a basket full of food, sometimes it was warmth, sometimes it was the path they had followed for days, washed away in a single night. But sometimes it gave something back. He closed his eyes, and let the first drops hit his shoulders, cold, gentle, searching. Rain had always come with memory, not spoken, but felt. You didn't just get wet, you felt the weight of every storm before this one. The way the water had filled cracks in the stone, and made them shiver. The way people had once huddled so close together under a half-broken roof, that no one could move without touching someone else's breath. The way a single downpour had once turned their only path to the hunt into a stream that carried away everything they trusted. But rain also meant change, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, always certain. He stepped out from under the tree, and walked into the open. The drops grew louder, harder, the ground darkened under his feet, soaking in the sky's grief. All around him, the world was beginning to move, leaves trembling, soil loosening, streams forming in places that had never held water before. This was the kind of rain that silenced even the birds, the kind that erased the smoke trail from a dying fire, the kind that didn't ask permission to enter, didn't wait for shelter to be found. It was the shelter, and the test. You had to find your strength inside it. Children asked why the rain sounded different at night. Elders never answered with words, they just listened, because rain in darkness, that was something older than understanding. It was the sound of the sky trying to speak a forgotten language, sometimes slow and steady, like a drumbeat in your bones, other times wild, sideways, screaming through branches, but always familiar, like a lullaby, sung by a voice that didn't need a face. And then there were the rains that came when no one wanted them, when food was low, when warmth was thin, when everyone prayed for stillness, and instead were given cold hands and wet feet. Those rains weren't just inconvenient, they were questions. Can you keep the fire going? Can you keep your will dry, even if nothing else is? But still, not all rain was unkind. Some rain came after loss, and somehow, it felt like comfort. It whispered to the ground. I remember too, it covered the old blood, it softened the footsteps, it pulled the scent of smoke down into the roots, where the stories could rest. When people sat together in silence during those storms, they didn't cry, they listened, because the rain carried something beyond water. It carried time. He remembered sitting beside his mother when he was small, her arm across his shoulders, her voice barely louder than the drip of water from the shelter roof. "Rain washes more than dirt," she had said once. "It washes what we can't speak." He hadn't known what she meant back then. But now, standing in the open, soaked through and unblinking, he did. The rain wasn't just falling from the sky. It was rising from the ground, too. From memory, from need, from all the things that couldn't be held any other way. It carried the taste of stone, the breath of roots, the feeling of being watched by something vast and slow and deeply kind. Rain made you small, but in a way that reminded you how much you belonged to the world. It didn't ask for anything back, it just arrived. And when it left, it never said goodbye. When the storm began to fade, the sounds changed. Drips instead of drops, softness instead of weight. The earth exhaled, and he stood there soaked and still, not shivering, not moving, just breathing. Because something inside him had been rinsed, not fixed, not healed, but acknowledged. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that's what rain was for. The smell that meant something was alive. It always came before sight, before movement, before the sound of breath or the rustle of grass. That sharp, strange smell, not of danger, exactly, but of presence, of life. Like the world was sending a message too subtle for words but too loud to ignore. They didn't have a name for it. Names came later, when things were broken into pieces and counted. But back then, it was a knowing, a shift in the air, a weight behind the wind. One moment, the forest was just trees and silence. The next, it was watching you, and you could smell it. It was the warmth of an animal's body, even if it was still hidden behind leaves. It was the trace of something that had passed, minutes ago, maybe seconds. A body that had brushed bark, stirred undergrowth, disturbed the resting air. It was damp fur, and breath still hanging in the cold. Sometimes it was sharp, like sweat. Sometimes musky, sometimes sour and clean all at once, but always unmistakably alive. He crouched low, motionless, eyes searching the edges of the brush. Nothing moved, no footfalls, no crackling leaves, but he didn't need those. The scent had changed. The forest had a new story now. The elders had taught him to listen with his nose, to feel with it, not just for food, though that mattered, but for everything. Rain coming, fire fading, a wound growing sour, a body too still for too long. Life, death, danger, promise, all of it lived in scent before it lived in sound. That morning, when he stepped out beyond the rock wall of the shelter, he'd smelled it right away. Not smoke, not fire, not hunger. Life, fresh, close, hidden, and not from his own. His breath had caught in his throat, not from fear, but from instinct. His skin prickled, his ears waited, but his nose already knew. Some scents meant meat, a hare burrowed close, a small herd passing through, a nest disturbed. Others meant movement, wolves nearby, not hunting yet, but thinking about it. Bears, deeper in, too full to charge, but too curious to ignore. But sometimes, the smell meant people, not his people. The others, he had learned to recognize them. Different smoke, different oils in their skin, different firewoods sapless and bitter. Even their fear had its own scent, so did their hunger. He remembered once, many nights before, when a stranger had passed too close to their camp. No one saw him, no one heard him, but everyone smelled him, and without speaking, they all stood at once. They had felt the shift, that scent that wasn't theirs, that life that didn't belong. No threat yet, but a reminder, you are not alone. That was what the scent meant most of all. You are not alone. Today it came again, in the trees, in the clearing, maybe animal, maybe not, but it was there. The smell of wet fur, of breath warmed against the cold, of blood moving fast beneath skin. He followed it carefully, not to chase, but to understand. The scent was like a trail without footprints, winding, thin, then suddenly strong again. It led through grass where no blades had bent, through shadow where nothing had stirred. But still, he followed, because it meant life, and life meant possibility. He stopped beside a fallen log, crouched low, and waited. The air was thicker here. He breathed through his nose, slow and quiet. There it was again, closer, stronger, still hidden. Then nothing. The scent vanished, gone like it had never been there, carried off by a shift in wind. Or perhaps the creature itself had gone still, hiding, watching back. But that was fine, because it had been real. He leaned against the log, eyes closed, listening not for sound, but for what remained in the air. The forest smelled different now, marked, alive. A reminder that nothing in this world moved alone, not for long. They say our ancestors didn't know language the way we do, but maybe they didn't need it. Maybe they spoke in scents, in silences, in the curl of wind through branches, and the way a fire changed when something living stepped too close. Maybe the first stories were told through smell, the scent of an old wound, of shared shelter, of birth, of decay, of meat, of rain, of fear, of comfort, of home. The smell of something that said, I'm still here, because sometimes, that was all you needed to know, that something was still breathing, that the world was still full of movement and waiting, that life hadn't left yet, that it was still walking, somewhere, just beyond your sight, and that you could still follow, even if it left no trail at all. When he tried to answer the sky, it wasn't that he expected a reply, not in words, not in signs, but there was something about the sky that felt awake, not just distant or cold or vast, awake and waiting. Even as a child, he'd felt it, lying on his back on stone still warm from the day's sun. He would stare until his eyes watered, until the stars began to pulse, until the night began to feel close enough to touch. And he would whisper, not because he believed the sky would speak back, but because it felt rude not to say something. Like being in the presence of someone far older, far wiser, who was always listening, even in silence. The elders never spoke of it directly. They spoke of clouds and seasons and the rhythm of stars. Yes, they taught him how to track time by the way light moved, how to measure the shift of a shadow against stone, how to wait until the moon fell just so behind the mountains. But they didn't speak of why it mattered, why it felt like the sky remembered more than they did, why it seemed to carry something none of them could name. He tried to answer it in the only ways he knew. First, with fire, a flame built alone, far from the others, one that he fed with careful hands and watched as it rose. He remembered how the smoke danced upward, wavering, thin, and how it disappeared into the dark. He thought, if I send something up, will it send something back down? Then, with stones, he carried them to the high ridge, the place where the wind felt sharper, more curious. He stacked them slowly, one atop another, letting their weight settle just right. He left the pile in a place where no one would trip over it, where no animal would bother it. A message not for Earth but for whatever watched from above. When the stack was still standing the next day, he smiled. It meant nothing, and yet, it felt like something. Later, he tried with sound, not words. Just breath. A hum carried on the cold air, long and low. He stood beneath a sky heavy with stars, the kind of night that made the trees hold still, and he let his voice lift, not singing, not calling, just being heard. The sound wobbled, caught in his throat, then steadied. He closed his eyes and kept going, letting his voice reach up toward the stars like smoke. Still, no reply. But he didn't stop, because the sky didn't need to speak to answer. It answered in patterns, in patience, in the way the stars always returned, even after long clouds, in the way storms rolled in with the same sound each time, and then left the same silence, in the way the sun, no matter how far it drifted south in winter, always began its slow return. He began to see these not as coincidences, but as rhythms, replies, gentle ones. And one night, something changed. He was alone, again, on the ridge. The fire was low, his back against the rock, his arms wrapped tight for warmth. The stars above him were sharp, unmoving, the air too cold for breath to linger. He was exhausted, not just in body, but in spirit, tired of waiting for answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask. But then he looked up, and he saw something move, not a bird, not a cloud, just a flicker of light, thin and pale, tracing a slow arc across the sky. It faded fast, almost nothing, but it felt different, like something had blinked at him. A single gesture from above, his breath caught. It could have been a star breaking, or the tail of a drifting ember from a fire far away. It could have been chance, but it didn't feel like chance. It felt like acknowledgement, not approval, not understanding, just recognition. As if the sky was saying, yes, I see you trying, and that was enough. From that night on, he didn't try to answer with fire or stone or song. He answered just by looking, by noticing, by paying attention, by standing outside, cold and still, when everyone else was tucked away, by learning the names of constellations no one else had named, by watching for the first flicker of dawn when the horizon was still black. The sky never changed. But he did. He learned that not all communication needs sound, that being heard doesn't always require speaking, that answering the sky wasn't about proving anything, It was about showing up, standing there again and again, and whispering silently, "I'm here." And when he became an elder himself, when his hands grew stiff and his eyes a little slower, he would sit near the fire, listening to the younger ones laugh, and glance up once more. And if the sky seemed particularly clear, he'd offer a quiet nod, because he knew, in a way he didn't need to explain, that sometimes the most ancient conversations are the ones that never end. The first time he dreamed, it didn't begin with color, or sound, or even feeling. It began with drift, that strange and weightless sensation that something was happening inside him while his body lay still. The fire had long faded to coals. The night was quiet, wrapped in thick, dark, and distant wind. He was lying beside the others, the familiar smell of fur and old ash around him, his chest rising slowly, his limbs heavy. But somewhere within that stillness, something loosened. He didn't know the word for it, didn't know that what was happening had never happened to him before. That something in his mind had finally grown enough to imagine without needing his eyes. There were shapes first, not real ones, not animals or people, just movement, swirling light without flame, motion without noise. His heart didn't race, and he didn't wake. It wasn't fear, it wasn't memory. It was something new, something soft and secret and large. Then came the sense that the air itself could bend, that stones could float and speak, that rivers could flow upward, that old wounds could vanish when touched, that the moon might hum if you listened long enough. None of it made sense, but none of it had to. In the dream, everything just was. He saw the cave he slept in, but brighter, stranger, painted in colors no hand had placed there. He saw the faces of people he knew, only they looked different, clearer, kinder, older, or maybe younger. It shifted, a child with his mother's voice, a hunter with the eyes of a wolf, a tree that whispered names into smoke. In the dream, he didn't question it, he simply watched. At one moment, the earth cracked open beneath him, not in terror, but in invitation, and from it rose, not fire, but light, gentle, gold, and slow. It wrapped around him like warmth, like memory, like a story too ancient to speak aloud. And though his mouth never moved, something inside him understood, not with words, but with knowing. He dreamed of walking alone, but never feeling lonely, of climbing a ridge that did not exist in waking life, where the stars hung so low he could touch them with open palms, of hearing music without sound, rhythms in the way wind passed through bones of trees, of tasting food that had never been cooked, but fed something deeper than hunger. He dreamed of animals speaking, not with mouths, but with presence. A bear who looked at him and shared a memory. A bird who circled overhead and dropped feathers that turned to fire. A fish whose scales shimmered with old stories no one had ever told. And then, just before waking, he dreamed of his own face, not as it was, but as it might one day become. Older, weathered, eyes lined with smoke and time. A face that had seen many winters, a face surrounded by others, younger, listening, a face at peace. He saw himself not as a child, not even as a man, but as something in between, becoming. That was the part that stayed. When the dream faded, when morning began to sneak in at the edges of the cave, when the warmth of the sun returned and the fire was stirred again, he didn't speak, not at first. He just sat quietly, watching the light move across the stone, feeling something inside him changed. He didn't understand it, but he knew something had happened, something new. Later, he tried to draw it in the dirt. Circles, waves, a path made of nothing but lines that twisted and disappeared. The others looked, nodded, didn't ask. They didn't know the word for it either, but they had seen the look in his eyes, the stillness, the quiet after something vast. And that night, when he lay back on the same bed of hides, when the fire was low again, and the wind began to hum against the cave's mouth, he waited, not for sleep, but for that place behind sleep, the one he now knew was there. He didn't always return. Dreams are like that, slippery, fickle, half-born. But from that night on, he was different. He understood that the mind could travel farther than the feet, that sometimes what lived inside you was just as wild and strange and sacred as the world outside. And maybe that's what made him truly human. Not fire, not tools, not words, but the dream. That vast and silent place where everything impossible waited patiently, just behind the dark. Why the stars moved differently. That night. No one noticed it at first. That night began like any other. The fire was slow and steady, casting long orange shapes across the stone walls. The air was still, cold, but not bitter. The kind of cold that made people tuck their limbs close, but not so deep that it threatened to bite. Somewhere, someone was humming. Not a song, exactly, but a rhythm. The kind passed down without knowing who started it. Above them, the sky was clear, and it had been clear for days. That alone made it feel safe. Familiar, reliable. It was one of the children who noticed. She had wandered to the edge of the clearing after everyone had settled. She wasn't searching for anything, just stretching her legs, watching her breath cloud in front of her. But when she looked up, something struck her. Something was off. The stars, those faithful sparks that always seemed to sit still, weren't where they were supposed to be. Not all of them. Just a few. She watched, wide-eyed, holding her breath. The sky above her was still full of the usual constellations. The curved line of the hunter's belt, the 3 scattered points that marked the path of the long-gone deer. But near the edge of the tree line, a small group of stars seemed wrong, too low, too close together, and they were moving. Slowly, yes, but definitely moving. She ran back to the fire, not shouting, just whispering, tugging at her older brother's arm. He followed her, blinking sleep from his eyes, and when he looked where she pointed, his brow furrowed. He called the others. Soon a small cluster of people stood in silence, all staring upward. It wasn't just imagination. They all saw it. 3 points of light, small and pale, weaving ever so slightly, drifting across the sky in a way stars shouldn't. Not like the slow crawl of the night wheel. Not like the path the moon etched across the hours. This was different. Not fast, but wandering. Like someone had let go of a pattern that had held for generations. At first no one spoke. They just stared. Some whispered stories. Some tried to remember if this had happened before. An old woman sat down slowly, knees cracking, eyes not leaving the strange path above. She said that once, when she was a girl, she saw something similar, just once, on a winter night, when the snow refused to fall. The oldest man in the group muttered that these were not stars at all, that they were eyes, watching, moving, choosing a path that touched places long forgotten. He didn't say whose eyes, or why. He didn't need to. Others disagreed. They said it was just wind, cold air in the sky, bending the light, or maybe a trick of the fire, reflecting on the curve of their eyes. But none of those words stopped the feeling that had crept over them, the feeling that something had shifted, because it wasn't just the stars. The air felt thicker, the forest quieter. Even the fire, though it burned steady, seemed to throw a slightly different glow. Shadows stretched in odd ways. Reflected faces looked just a little older, a little more tired, or maybe just more real. And then came the sound, faint, like cloth dragged across stone, like breath drawn through hollow wood. Not threatening, not sharp, just there, floating above them, low and wide, without source. A few people stepped back. One man knelt, touched the earth with both hands, and whispered something. A word he hadn't said in years. Maybe a name, maybe a plea. The stars continued to move. By now they had shifted just enough to leave the place they'd started. One blinked out entirely, as if swallowed by a darker patch of sky. Another paused. A third, the brightest, flared just slightly, as if exhaling, and then they stopped. No noise, no wind, just stillness. Eventually, people drifted back to the fire. No one laughed, no one called it silly. They didn't need to. They had seen it together, and that was enough. The child who had first noticed the change didn't sleep. She lay near the fire, eyes open, face turned to the heavens, watching in case something happened again. But the stars, those strange wandering points, didn't return to their pattern. They just stayed where they had stopped, settled, silent. In the days that followed, no one could explain it. No one tried very hard, but something changed. They were quieter in the evenings, slower to speak when sitting beneath the open sky, more likely to glance upward in the middle of a sentence, as if listening for something they couldn't name. And every night after that, when the fire was low and the sky was clear, someone, always someone, would step a little further from the group, just to look, just to see, not in fear, but in wonder, because that was the night the stars moved differently, and no one ever forgot it. What the earth hid beneath his steps. He had walked across the world without knowing what lay beneath it. His feet pressed into soft dirt and rough stone, into moss-covered roots and sand left behind by water long gone. Each step was simple, a movement of the body, a push forward, a rhythm. He had never thought to wonder what the ground carried with it. But the earth remembered. Every place he crossed held something just beneath the surface. The dry mud of an old riverbed held the curve of a shell, long dead, pressed into the shape of the land. In the shadow of a cliff, where wind gathered in whispers, lay the charred bones of a fire older than memory. The sand that slid between his toes was full of crushed creatures whose names no one had ever spoken, and he walked across them without knowing, without pausing. But still, the earth gave way. Sometimes when he stopped to drink or rest, he would feel something odd beneath him, a dip in the ground that didn't match the land around it, a stone too smooth, or too sharp, or placed where no hand had placed it. He didn't ask questions. There were no words for those questions yet, but he felt them. Once, as he sat near a stream that had carved through layers of rock, he saw lines in the cliff face, bands of red and black, of white speckled with darkness. He traced them with his eyes, then with his fingers. They felt like pages of something too large to read, a record not written in marks, but in weight. He didn't know it, but he was staring at time. Other places held stranger things, a tree growing out of a mound that smelled faintly of something sweet, not from the tree, but from the earth itself. He dug once, slowly, with his hands, and found the curve of a skull, not human, not animal, something in between. He didn't touch it again. He covered it with soil, and did not return. But he remembered. The earth had layers, not just of stone and soil, but of memory, of stories too quiet to speak aloud. Every footstep pressed into that silence. Every movement stirred it, dusting away pieces of what had once been something living, something buried, something sacred. He learned slowly to feel when the ground was holding something. It was in the way the wind moved above it, in the way birds went quiet, or insects grew still. He began to notice which places were heavy, and which were hollow, which held warmth near the surface, and which held cold that seemed to rise up into his bones. And sometimes he swore he could hear it. Not words, not sound exactly, but a pressure behind the silence, a presence, the sense that beneath his feet were not just rocks and roots, but bones, tools, stories, fire pits lost to time, children who had laughed and gone silent, songs sung only once, now folded into clay. He began to walk more slowly, not out of fear, but respect, because he understood, even if he didn't have the words, that the ground remembered what people forgot, that every hill might be a grave, that every flat stretch of soil might once have been a home, that even the stones had witnessed things he would never know. One evening, as dusk fell and the sky turned pale blue behind the trees, he found a circle of rocks, half buried, half scattered. They weren't natural, he could tell. Someone had placed them there, long ago, maybe for warmth, maybe for prayer, maybe for a meal. But no fire burned there now, only soft grass, and silence. He didn't disturb it. He sat beside it, palms resting on his knees, eyes closed, not sleeping, just listening. The earth said nothing, but it didn't need to. He knew now that silence had shape. That quiet could tell you everything, if you gave it space. And beneath him, just inches away, were stories older than speech, shadows of people who had walked before him, who had loved, feared, eaten, waited, died. And maybe somewhere deep, their warmth still lingered, not as heat, but as presence. When he rose again, the night was almost full, the stars blinked overhead, and the trees whispered above him. He stepped carefully, not as if the ground might break, but as if it might wake. The earth had given him everything, food, shelter, fire, water. But now he knew it gave something else too. It gave memory. And everywhere he walked, he carried that with him, not on his back, but beneath his feet. When he sat still for the first time, it wasn't planned. There was no decision, no voice in his head that said, now. It simply happened. One moment he was moving, as he always had, tracking something unseen, looking for water, for warmth, for food, for meaning, and then he wasn't. His body stopped, his legs folded, and he sat. Still, for the first time there was no injury to rest, no fire to tend, no hunger gnawing him forward, just stillness. Like something ancient inside him had asked him to stop, not out of exhaustion, but out of something quieter, something he didn't yet know the name for. The world didn't rush to fill the silence. No sudden winds, no calls from birds, no urgent footsteps behind him. Only breath, his own, slow, unrushed. His hands rested on his thighs, heavy but not tired. His eyes didn't search the tree line. He didn't scan the sky. He just looked, not at something, just with something. The dirt, the distance, the soft, strange weight of being unhurried. Around him, the world carried on. A beetle moved across a stone, a leaf fell, a branch creaked in the windless air, and still he sat. Nothing in him reached to interrupt it, and slowly he realized something that had always been true but never visible until now. The world didn't need him to move in order to exist. It moved on its own, and maybe, so could he. His heartbeat slowed in that stillness. It had always matched his stride before, fast when he ran, pounding when he hunted, cautious when he crept. But now it fell into a different rhythm, not reactive, not survival, just presence. It didn't race ahead or brace for a blow. It sat with him, steady, like a drum learning a new beat. Time felt different here. It didn't vanish. It unwrapped. It stretched out, long and quiet, like a river deciding not to rush. He could feel the shape of each second, not as pressure but as a gift, something that had always been his, if he'd only known how to hold it. He didn't know this yet, but what he was doing, what felt so strange and useless, would become a practice carried through millennia. Whole people would later name it, ritualize it, shape stories around it. But for him here now, it was nothing grand. It was just the first time he let the world arrive without trying to catch it. He noticed things too, the way the air touched his skin, the way the ground pressed back into him, not harsh, but steady, like it had been waiting to be felt. The distant scent of ash, the way birdsong carried farther in stillness than in motion. His body didn't ache for food in that moment, or warmth, or even company. It just was. He could feel his own weight, not as burden, but as truth. This was where he was, and it was enough. The strange thing was, nothing around him changed. The trees stayed where they were, the sky didn't darken or brighten, the ground didn't shake, but something inside shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but undeniably. It was the first time he felt that staying could mean more than going, that not chasing something might still lead to something. He stayed there until the sun touched the top of the trees, not because he forgot the world, but because he had for a time become part of it. And when he rose, he didn't rush. He moved like the silence had shaped him, like the earth had shared a secret, only he had heard. And though he would walk again, and hunt, and build, and search, a part of him would always remember this stillness, this pause, this first true breath. And one day, when others came after him, when fire burned and tools scattered, and stories bloomed in circles, he would teach them, not with words but with example, that stillness wasn't absence, it was knowing, and that sometimes the deepest truth came not in the step, but in the sitting. Why silence followed him longer than sound? Sound had always been part of the world. The rustle of leaves in a restless wind, the cracking of dry twigs under bare feet, the groan of the trees as they stretched into the sky, the sudden call of an animal, sharp, purposeful, then gone, his own breath, his heartbeat, the hush of water slipping over stone. He'd lived with sound, expected it, followed it, flowed from it, but what he never expected was how silence came after, not as absence, but as a presence in its own right. It didn't arrive with fanfare, it crept in, quietly, after a branch snapped, after a rock tumbled, after a word was spoken. It was what remained when the air swallowed a sound whole, and once he noticed it, truly noticed, it followed him. He thought, at first, that silence meant nothing was happening, that it was empty space between moments. But the longer he walked, the longer he sat beneath trees or crouched beside shallow streams, the more he realized how full it really was. Silence was not the absence of life. It was life holding its breath. When he moved through the tall grasses, animals stilled before he ever saw them. They didn't run with sound. They waited, hidden, alert, not gone, just listening. And he realized they were better at it than he was. He had ears, yes, but silence was something they understood in their bones. The first time he noticed it clearly, he had just shouted, a sharp noise, thrown at the wind, not out of anger, but out of need. He had lost sight of the others. The sound left his mouth and echoed once faintly into the trees, and then, it didn't fade. It was devoured. The forest took it in like a held breath, and then returned nothing. That silence felt louder than any cry. It followed him after that. Not in the trees, but inside him. He began to notice, when silence deepened, how it changed in different places. In caves, it wrapped around him, like a second skin. beneath rock overhangs, it rang in his ears, like something watching. In open plains, it drifted gently but wide, like a soft warning from faraway places. Even in sleep, it found him. When the fire burned low, and the last voices fell quiet, when the night animals passed far from camp, and even the wind gave up moving, that's when it came. Not fear, not noise, just a silence so complete it felt like the world had stepped aside to let something else through. He didn't always trust it, because in silence he could hear himself, the shift of his muscles, the doubt in his breath, the thoughts that only arrived when nothing else filled their space. Silence was not passive, it asked questions he couldn't answer, it waited, like it knew more than he did. Still he grew used to it. There were days he didn't speak at all, not because he had no one to talk to, but because the silence seemed to understand him better. He began to use it like a tool. He'd stay quiet when tracking, not just his feet, but his mind. He let thoughts drift, let movement slow, and the world answered in kind. A bird would return to its branch, a small animal would scurry again. The silence would shift, but not leave. It accompanied. He learned to measure it. The length of silence after a snap told him how far the herd was. The stillness in a cave told him whether it had ever held fire. The hush around certain trees meant they were older than they looked. The way silence lingered after a storm told him where water would flow next. Silence had weight, and it didn't vanish when sound returned. Even after laughter, after footsteps, after flames, he could feel it at the edge, waiting, not impatient, just present. Over time, others noticed too. They began to follow him more quietly. They didn't ask him why, they just moved softer, sat longer, listened with more than ears, not to sounds, but to the silence between them. Because silence wasn't what came when nothing happened, it was the happening. It was the breath between thoughts, the space where memory was made, the still moment before a leap, a hunt, a word, and long after the fire had burned low, after the last story had been told, after the last heartbeat had stilled in sleep, silence remained, not as an end, but as the quiet keeper of all that had come before, and he walked with it, not ahead, not behind, but beside, because once you truly hear silence, it never leaves you. The stone he carried without knowing why. He had picked it up without thinking, not during a hunt, or a journey, or any moment that seemed important. It wasn't shaped like a tool, it wasn't sharp enough to cut or heavy enough to smash. It didn't sparkle, it didn't mark direction. It wasn't warm, it didn't carry the scent of fire or animal or water. It was just a stone, rounded, worn smooth by time or river or wind. Somewhere between the size of his palm and his heart, cool to the touch when he first held it, slightly darker than the other stones nearby, a little heavier, but not enough to matter. He noticed it. He bent down. He lifted it, and then he didn't let it go. He had no reason. No one had told him to keep it. No voice inside declared it sacred. He didn't know if it had once belonged to someone else. No story attached itself to it. Yet from that moment, it became his companion. Not strapped to his waist or tied in a pouch. He simply kept it. Sometimes in his hand, sometimes in the fold of his wrap, sometimes beside him when he slept. It didn't do anything, but he kept it close. Days passed, and it was still with him. Sometimes it would slip from his grasp while he walked, and he would pause, half a dozen steps later, turn, search, and retrieve it. Other times it would rest unnoticed in the dirt beside his bedding until he felt for it in the morning, just to make sure it hadn't wandered too far. Others noticed. One asked if it was useful. He said no. Another asked if it was from his family. He didn't know. An elder eyed it once during a quiet meal and said nothing at all. It became a quiet habit. When he sat, it rested on his thigh. When he waited, it filled his palm. When he listened to stories, he ran his thumb along its curve. He'd hold it when thoughts wouldn't settle. He'd press it against his chest when sleep wouldn't come. Over time the stone grew warmer faster, whether from skin or breath or time, he didn't know. It fit him better. The weight of it was no longer strange. It was expected. It balanced him, like one foot following the other. The stone was part of the pattern. He began to feel something strange. When he left it behind, even for a short while, a small unease crept in, not fear, not urgency, but a gap, as if his hand had forgotten what to do without it, like a word missing from a sentence, like a beat skipped in a song. And when he returned to it, The world clicked back into rhythm. He started to assign meaning to it. But only softly. Maybe it was from the place where he first felt safe. Maybe it was from the stream where he saw the sky reflected. Maybe it was from the moment before the storm when everything stood still. He didn't know. But he wondered. That was enough. There were moments when he almost threw it away, not out of anger, but in confusion. What was it for? He had carried it through hunger, rain, long climbs, endless watches. He had packed it beside food when there wasn't enough food. He had held it in one hand while dragging wood with the other. It slowed him, it served no purpose, but each time he set it down with the thought of walking away, he didn't. The stone stayed with him, not because he needed it, but because he chose it. In a world where everything had to mean something, had to be eaten, or worn, or burned, or sharpened, this stone was different. It meant nothing, and maybe that made it mean everything. It became a part of his story, quietly, without asking. And in a time before names, before writing, before maps, the things we carried became the chapters of who we were. His chapter had a stone in it, not to tell a story, but to hold one. One day, without noticing, he passed it to a child, just for a moment, during a firelit night. The child held it as if it had always been theirs. They felt the warmth, the smoothness, the silence inside it. And when they passed it back, they looked at him differently, not with curiosity, but with understanding. The stone was never explained. It didn't need to be, because sometimes what we carry isn't about utility, it's about memory, felt through weight. It's about presence, shaped by touch. It's about being known, without having to speak. And long after tools broke, after shelters collapsed, after names were forgotten, someone might one day find a stone among ashes or dust and feel the same pull, the same warmth, and wonder what story lived inside a stone that someone chose to carry, day after day, for no reason at all. The first sound he made on purpose. It wasn't a word. There were no words yet. Not really. Not the kind that lived outside the body. No names passed from mouth to mouth. No set meanings. No sounds tied forever to things or people or places. Communication lived in gesture, in glances, in the way one moved through space or shifted their weight beside another. Silence still did most of the talking, but there was a moment, quiet and small, when he opened his mouth and made a sound that did not come from pain or hunger or surprise. It wasn't instinctive. It wasn't forced out by breath or fear. It came from somewhere else, somewhere inside, and it was made on purpose. A simple sound, low, soft, not loud enough to startle, not sharp enough to echo, just enough to travel the short distance between him and the other figure sitting across the embers of a fading fire. The fire crackled faintly. Shadows moved behind them, flickering against the back of the cave. The others were already asleep, bundled into skins, their backs rising and falling with the slow rhythm of rest. But he was awake. So was she. They had eaten but not spoken. There hadn't been a need. Survival didn't ask for conversation, only coordination. She had gathered roots. He had returned with a small animal, its skin still warm when he carried it in. They had cooked it, shared it, then waited. Not for anything in particular, just for the night to pass, and then he made the sound. It wasn't directed at her, not exactly. It floated, unsure, halfway across the distance between them. It carried nothing more than the intention to be heard. It wasn't a call, it wasn't a signal. It was more like an opening, a moment of stillness that stepped forward, gently, asking to be noticed. She turned her head, slowly, eyes catching the glow of the fire. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. He felt something strange then, an echo inside his chest, as if the sound had bounced back, but not through the air, through her attention. It made him feel seen in a way that gesture never had, not just observed, recognized. He repeated it, a little louder this time. Not much. She didn't respond with words, there were none, but she mimicked the sound slightly different in tone, a little higher, drawn out longer, not mocking, not mirroring, answering. It surprised him, not the sound itself, but the idea that something he made could be shared, that a noise from his own throat could create a bridge between two people, not a tool, not a weapon, just sound. And it didn't need to name anything to mean something. They sat that way for a while, trading tones, not always back and forth, sometimes layered, sometimes silent. Sometimes the sounds were shaped by the rhythm of breath or the lilt of curiosity. No pattern, no grammar, but there was music in it, primitive, broken, real. No one taught him how to do it. No one needed to. The knowledge had always been there, buried under instinct, waiting for stillness, waiting for warmth, waiting for company. This sound, this first sound, wasn't about conveying information. It wasn't about asking or warning or commanding. It was about being. It was about existing near another and saying, "I am here, and I know you are too." Later, others would begin to copy them. Children at first, then others. New sounds were tried. Some carried laughter, others carried sorrow, some warned, some welcomed, but none of them would ever feel quite like that first one, because the first was made without expectation, without plan. It was not a tool yet. It was a reaching out in the dark. Over time, sounds would be given meanings, meaning would form language, language would give rise to memory, and memory would carry culture, story, lineage. But before all of that, before history began, there was a single sound in the night, made without need, given without demand, returned without fear. He wouldn't remember the exact pitch of it, or what it sounded like, but he remembered the silence before it, and how different the world felt after. What the earth promised, and took back. He had trusted the ground beneath his feet. It seemed solid, dependable. It gave him what he needed: roots to chew, stones to shape, clay to hold water, dust to mark paths, and the soft weight of moss to rest his head against. The earth was never questioned. It simply was. Its silence didn't make it unknowable. If anything, it made it sacred. There was a place he returned to often, a low bend between two hills, where the soil stayed warmer, and water didn't vanish when the sun rose too fast. The trees leaned in around it, not thickly, but enough to form a quiet barrier between the winds and the world. There, the ground gave easily to his hands when he dug for bulbs. There, his feet didn't ache after walking. The birds seemed louder. The sky seemed calmer. He never named it, but he knew it, and it knew him. He thought of it as a kind of promise that some parts of the world would remain gentle, that some patches of earth would allow him to be more than desperate, more than wandering. He didn't need to explain it. He just returned to that place when he could, sat on the familiar rock by the slope, and let the hours pass without struggle. One day, he brought others, not many, just two. One who walked with a limp, another who had lost a sleeping place to flood and ash. He brought them without thinking twice, guiding them with confidence, pointing to the spot where they could drink and rest and not be afraid. But something had changed. The water was lower. The soil was strange, crumbled and hard, near the top, but soft and slick underneath, like the ground wasn't sure what season it belonged to. He couldn't hear the birds. The trees looked too still. Still, he said nothing. They settled there for the night, and that night, the rain came. It started gently, like it often did, just enough to hush the wind, but it didn't stop. It thickened, deepened. It sounded different against the leaves, closer, heavier, not like drops, but like something pressing. The slope he trusted began to groan, not loudly, but enough to make him sit upright in the dark. Then, the earth moved, not like a quake, not sudden, more like a decision. The slope didn't crack, it shifted. The wet ground, now bloated and unsure of itself, rolled downward in silence. The rock where he always sat was no longer visible. The trees above it leaned forward, roots slipping slowly into the muck, like fingers loosening their grip. He shouted once loud enough to wake the others, but the sound was swallowed by the thick air, made small by the roaring hush of rain on leaves. One of them, the one with the limp, was already gone, swept somewhere in the mud, not screaming, just taken. The other scrambled toward him. They climbed together. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The earth was no longer their ally. By morning, the place was unrecognizable. Where the warmth had been, there was a gouged scar of churned-up mud and broken roots. Where water had once flowed, there was now only standing sludge. The rock he had rested against was buried. So were the footprints. So were the berries they had gathered. So was the trust. He stood there long after the sun rose, caked in soil, soaked to the bone, arms streaked with blood and silt, and he looked down not with anger, but with confusion, like a child who had been scolded by a parent they didn't know they'd wronged. The earth had made a promise, hadn't it? But then again, he had never asked. He had only assumed. It was then he began to understand the earth did not promise. It simply was, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, sometimes warm and soft and safe, other times distant, cold, hungry. It gave, and it took, not because it judged, but because it moved, it aged, it shifted like breath, like thought, like sky. That was the beginning of reverence, not love, not worship, something quieter, a knowing that nothing could be held forever. that even the ground could vanish, that even safety had a season. Later, when he found new ground, he never walked the same way again. His steps grew slower, he listened more, he watched how the trees leaned, he touched the soil before lying down, he looked for the cracks before building, and he never ever called any place his own. He would still tell others where to rest, where to drink, where to gather, but he no longer said, "This place will keep you safe." Instead he'd murmur, barely loud enough for others to hear, "It's good, for now, because the earth never promised, and if it did, it always had the right to take it back." The trace he left. That wasn't a footprint. There were no carvings, no painted walls, no monuments or towering stones, no symbols etched into bark or bone. No one wrote his name because no name had yet been invented. But still, he left something behind. Not a footprint, though there were many, and not one of them survived. What he left was quieter than that. It lived in the way another picked up a piece of flint, because he had picked it up first. It lingered in the careful bend of a knee when approaching water, in the way someone waited for silence before walking into the wind. It hummed in the fire that didn't go out one particular night, because someone remembered to feed it the way he once had. It echoed in the half sound between two people when they didn't know what to say, but still said something anyway. The trace wasn't made with tools. It was made in moments. The pause before eating, the stare into the sky that lasted longer than necessary, the shared glance across the smoke, things too small to mark, too soft to measure, but they lasted in instinct, in caution, in warmth shared without words, in a fire carried in a bundle of dry moss across miles, in a gesture passed down without anyone realizing it had once been new. He was never buried. No mound marks the place where he lay. Maybe he was left under a sky still blinking from the first stars. Maybe only the earth remembers where his bones returned to dust. But those who walked after him, they carried him forward, because that's what humans did. Even then, even before stories had shape or sound, they passed on what mattered, whether they meant to or not, and what he left was not a single thing. It was a way to stay alive a little longer, a way to wait for the sun, even when the night stretched too long, a way to look at another and not feel entirely alone. He did not know he was the first, but someone else saw how he sat near the fire, someone else saw how he turned his head toward the stars, and something about that stayed. So no, there are no monuments. But the trace is there, not in stone, not in footprint, but in every breath that dared to hope morning would come. Hey guys, thank you for being here. That was what the earth remembered about the first man. A quiet walk into a time before names, before memory had shape, before anything was written down, and yet everything was felt. If this story stayed with you, even in silence, I'd love if you'd subscribe, like the video, and maybe share it with someone else who finds comfort in slow stories and ancient echoes. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Until next time, stay soft, stay wondering, and let the earth hold your steps gently. But the trace is there, not in stone, not in footprint, but in every breath that dared to hope morning would come.